Welcome to Raportul decât. We will be discussing today about the most recent evidence related to the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs in the context of COVID-19. Our special guest is Dr. Aimo Kannt, who is head of research division for drug discovery at Fraunhofer Institute for Translational Medicine and Pharmacology. Thank you so much, Dr. Kannt, for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, at the beginning of the pandemic, the safety of NSAIDs, especially ibuprofen in COVID-19, has been called into question, and the concerns were raised mostly around the susceptibility to the virus and the severity of the disease. However, scientific evidence from the past 2 years seem to rule out these initial hypotheses. What do we know so far about the safety profile of NSAID in COVID-19?
As you said, it was a hypothesis that, ibuprofen and potentially also other NSAIDs may lead to detrimental outcomes in COVID-19. And the hypothesis was based on speculation that ibuprofen could, for example, increase the expression of the entry receptor for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's a protein called ACE2. And that by this increase in ACE2 expression, virus entry may be facilitated, or may be enhanced in people taking ibuprofen or other NSAIDs. However, there is no evidence, there's no clinical or biological evidence actually in favor of this hypothesis. In contrast, most of the clinical observations that were made over the last 2 years, as well as biological experiments, do not point in that direction that ibuprofen or other NSAIDs may increase the risk of developing severe COVID-19 after a SARS-CoV-2 infection.
Your latest research published at the beginning of this year confirms actually that non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medication and acetaminophen do not result in worse COVID-19 outcomes, and actually sheds new light on the interaction between these drugs and ACE2 expression. What was exactly the objective of your study?
The objective was to investigate in a biological setting, less so in a clinical setting, but more in a biological setting, whether ibuprofen and other non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs have an influence really on ACE2 expression, both in cell culture, but also in vivo, in mice. And at the same time, we wanted to see whether in the presence of either ibuprofen or other non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, the entry of the SARS-CoV-2 virus into the host cell is enhanced or inhibited. So what we did is we looked at the expression of ACE2 as at the mRNA level, also at the protein level, and also at the activity of ACE2 in human cells in the presence or absence of ibuprofen at different concentrations or other NSAIDs. And then we looked at the influence of ibuprofen administration to mice on ACE2 expression in different tissues and organs that are related, to organs affected by SARS-CoV-2 infections. And finally, we looked into SARS-CoV-2 infection using the real SARS-CoV-2 virus in human cells, and whether the presence of ibuprofen or other NSAIDs has any influence on that. And using, these biological experiments, we could not confirm that ACE2 expression is amplified or is increased, or that viral entry is facilitated by ibuprofen or other NSAIDs that we studied.
What do you consider to be the strengths of this new evidence, and how can this be translated into clinical practice?
I think the strength is that it's a kind of basic science. So we really try to look into the basic details and molecular mechanisms that could in principle lead to ibuprofen or other NSAIDs influencing severity of COVID-19 infections. We used human cells. We used the real SARS-CoV-2 virus, so not a surrogate or not a pseudovirus system, and by making sure that the tools and the systems that we applied in our study are related to what really happens in people, we think that the translatability of our findings to the clinical situation is quite good. I mean, still, it's in cells and in mice, so it's not in people. But I think our findings are quite close to what probably happens also in the clinical situation.
How could the healthcare professionals or the authorities in other countries could relate to the results of this study for recommendations?
Yeah, what you can take from the results of our study is that on a biological, on a cellular level, in the setting that we applied for our experiments, there was no increase in SARS-CoV-2 infection risk seen with ibuprofen or other NSAIDs. At high concentrations of ibuprofen, we even saw a slight decrease in infection risk. So from this data, it is very difficult, I would say, to reconcile the original hypothesis that ibuprofen may worsen COVID-19. For this, we saw no indication. Of course, it's an artificial system. It's cells, it's biological experiments. It's not patients, and it's not the clinical setting. But from what we saw in our experiments, and importantly, similar findings were also published by others. So there's independent confirmation of what we saw, do not point towards an increase in risk of severity of COVID-19 when treated with NSAIDs like ibuprofen or others. And I think healthcare professional can take this as an indication. It's not proof. You never get proof in science, but it's a very strong indication that the original speculation was not founded.
And what other relevant data that was published in the last 2 years would you mention to complement this result?
Most importantly, clinical data. So there have been publications from quite large observational studies looking at the influence of co-medication such as NSAIDs or ibuprofen also in particular on COVID-19 severity and outcome. And they could not confirm the original hypothesis that ibuprofen may worsen COVID-19.
I think ibuprofen was just one of the common drugs that were a subject of fake news in the past years and got into this whole infodemia that spread along with the SARS-CoV-2. Mm-hmm. What is your experience with communicating data around this class of drugs? What would be your advice?
I would be careful with using the word fake news. I wouldn't say it was fake news because the original hypothesis was a hypothesis, but the reception by the media was different. They kind of saw it as a fact and interpreted it as a kind of fact. Oh, ibuprofen may increase the expression of ACE2 and may make COVID-19 worse. In a way, when you think back 2 years, how much was not known at the beginning of COVID-19, and people were very careful and also were a bit uneasy and irritated with the whole situation. This may all have led to this kind of perception as it was at that time. I wouldn't really call it fake news. But my advice would be always look at the scientific and at the clinical evidence, and make sure that in communications, and this is true, of course, in the scientific environment, but also in social media and in the press, make sure that you make a distinction between what is hypothesis, what is speculation, and what is scientifically founded, and what is the evidence. And probably, at that time, people had some difficulties to make this distinction.
Thank you so much. Are there any other messages you would like to send on this topic?
No, I think we covered it quite well. So it's as dramatic as the times are with the pandemics, from a scientific perspective, it's also been a very, I would say, interesting period, because there were a lot of new findings came out of research directed towards COVID-19. We are so lucky that we have vaccines, to make sure that, or to reduce the risk of developing severe COVID-19 dramatically, and that we were able, or companies actually were able to develop these new vaccines in a record period of time. So we learned a lot during this COVID-19 pandemic, and I hope that this will make us better prepared, for the next pandemic that will come at some stage, and that we are all, wiser and all smarter and better prepared than for this new epidemic or new pandemic that may come.
Dr. Kannt, thank you very much for all your messages and your time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.